In this tutorial I'm going to show you how to make a Rever collar. So I've sewn my shoulder seams together to start with, and I've marked these 2 points on the front, both sides. They're also marked on the top collar and the under collar. So these 2 points are from my pattern, and I used a Winifred Aldridge pattern to create this Rever collar. So they're really important to make sure that they're there. I've stitched a line all the way around the neckline to stop the neckline from stretching, and I've clipped the neckline as well. So I've stitched in a black thread so you can actually see, otherwise you would just stitch in a normal collar. So over here I'm just going to do a mitre, which is a cut towards the dot. So where you've got the corner dot, the second one in, you just clip towards it to create a mitre, and that allows you to open up that section to attach it to the collar. Okay, so on my collar, this is the under collar and it's interfaced. So the under collar gets attached to the garment itself. I have a notch at the centre back of my under collar, and I'll have a notch at the centre back of my neck to match up. So placing right sides of fabric together, I'm going to pin my garment section at the neck to the under collar. Okay, so now what I need to do is match up the corresponding dots. So you put a pin straight through one dot on the collar, from the garment to the collar. So remember, the garment is on the top. So I'm just going to put the pin in and out directly next door to where it's gone in. So it's just pinching a couple of millimeters of fabric, but through both layers. And then line up the second dot. I've done these in pencil because I'm doing a calico sample, so you're probably better off doing them with a chalk pencil instead, so you can rub them out. That's my first dot, and the second one's matched up, goes round the back neck over to the other side of my front, and then I'm going to match up the next 2 points. So it's really important that you get these accurate. So again, the pin on this one is just going in and out a couple of millimeters next door to where it went in, and that allows me to pivot around to the final point. Just match them up and pin those together, making sure they're accurately put together. Okay, so the 4 points are pinned in, and now I'm going to just pin the rest of my neckline to the collar. So again, I've stitched this already. I've got a stitch line I can follow, and that's stopping the neck from stretching. Just make sure you line up all the edges of your seam allowance on the collar and the garment, so they're right on top of each other and there's no discrepancy. So you're going to sew it 1 centimetre down. I've put in a few pins. If your fabric is a little bit slippery, you may need to put a few more pins in. And then we're going to start here up to the second point, pivot, moving this out of the way, and then go along to the third point, again pivot here with the machine needle, moving the fabric out of the way, finishing at the 4th point. So I'm going to start right on the dot. Okay, so put the needle right inside, remove your pin, and then a couple of stitches forwards, and then a couple of back stitches so it doesn't come undone. You need to start right on the point and don't go past it. Come to your second one, and you want to move this section of fabric out of the way so you're only ever sewing on 2 layers. It's really easy to catch this under the machine, so go slowly and make sure you put your needle right into the second point, and then that's the pivot point, making sure it's thrown through 2 layers, and then follow your seam allowance, removing your pins as you go all the way along the back neck. Just make sure if it's moving you level it up so it's only a 1 centimetre seam allowance on the collar and the garment as well. This can be quite tricky, so take your time. Coming up to the third point now, this is a pivot point again, so go nice and slowly with your sewing machine, and you want to make sure the needle of the machine goes right into the point, and just again 2 layers of fabric only. So move the fabric out of the way and very slowly remove your pin, and then you can pivot around and sew to the final point. So go really carefully. You want to finish at the dot and go back a couple of back stitches. Do not go past this point. And then once you're there, a couple of back stitches. So just to show you, this is my 2 front facings and my back neck facing, and it's exactly the same as the front. It's got the 4 dots on, the shoulder seams are sewn, and I've mitered and I've clipped the back neck. And this is my top collar. Generally the top collar isn't interfaced. Okay, so going back to the garment with the undercollar, you're going to clarify the seams at this point along the neck that you've just sewn. So with your fingers just open up the seams, and there's a little fold. You can see where the fabric folds over your seam allowance in that corner. We're going to cut that off in a minute because it'll be bulky. So just very carefully open up the seam allowance between the collar and the garment and give it a gentle press all the way along. If it needs clipping, further clipping, then clip it with your scissors along the neck. For this I use a sleeve board to lift the fabric off of the ironing board, and again there's another little overlap of fabric there, so I've just created a little pleat in the collar section. So I'm going to cut that away now because it will be bulky if it was in, because there's a few layers there, so it would be bulky underneath of the collar, so it needs to go. So that's that one, and then clip that one. If I was using a much thicker fabric it would be very bulky, so you don't want to feel that on the collar once you've made your garment. Okay, so just give it a gentle press and make sure you're happy with it. Okay, so turn it over and just check your corners. They're really nice and square here. There are no puckers and it fits nicely around on both sides. Both sides are nice. So this is my collar and facings, and I've done exactly the same here. Pressed it open and taken anything off, checked that that's okay. That fits quite nicely. So once you're happy with both pieces, you're going to put right sides together of the collar. So we're going to start with the collar first. So place them right sides together, centre back. I've got a little notch on both of them, so I'm going to pin both collars together at the centre back. The under collar, which is interfaced, is cut on the bias so it fits around the neck nicely and moulds around the neck. So go back to where the points are and pop a pin in, and you're going to match these up on both collars. So just pop a pin in, making sure you've not come through the seam itself. So you don't want the pin to go through the seam that you've just sewn. So just pop a pin in and take your time. Okay, so now I'm going to pin the seam allowances down towards the body of the garment so they're completely out of the way on both sides. So flip it over, smooth the seam allowances that you've just pressed open downwards towards the garment, just through the 3 layers, 2 lots of seam allowance in the garment. Okay, because you really don't want to sew over these seam allowances. So I'm just going to line up the seam on the collar, under collar and top collar, and pop a pin in there to hold it in place so I know they sit right on top of each other. Okay, then I'm going to sew from the dot to the corner, around the collar, top of the collar, back down to my second dot here. So do exactly the same on that side. Okay, so I'm going to sew from this dot that corresponds with the one underneath. The seam allowances are pinned completely out of the way along the top of the collar and down, and I'm going to finish at that dot. And again, the seam allowances are both tucked downwards, so at no point do you sew over the seam allowances. So put the needle of the machine right in at the dot, and only 2 thicknesses of fabric, so not over the seam allowance at all, so it's just the collar sections you're sewing together here. When you're happy with the positioning, a couple of stitches forwards and then a couple of back. Just make sure you don't go on the seam allowance at all. And then I'm just going to sew the 2 collar sections together. Take your time. Here you can just pivot, or if you've got a thicker fabric you should do 1 stitch across. Just check your seam allowances aren't caught as well at this stage. And again, I'm just going to pivot at this corner instead of doing 1 stitch across and then down, because I'm using calico and it's a lightweight fabric. So I'm now going to sew to the dot, and I'm going to finish just on the dot and not on the seam allowance. So don't, if you hit the seam allowance, you have to unpick it. So at the dot, just the 2 layers and then back stitch. So you've just sewn the 2 layers of the collar together. Okay, then back stitch. Then just check it's just through the 2 layers and your seam allowance is still free. And just check that it's fine and you haven't caught any of the seam allowances at all, which I haven't. Okay, for sewing the lapel, I'm now going to pin the seam allowances upwards towards the collar. So both seam allowances on the facing and on the garment are going to be pushed up out of the way, so they don't get stitched over at all. And then just locate where your dots are, and they should actually be on top of each other because you've just sewn the collar together. Okay, so just to make sure they are on top of each other, pop a pin in through, making sure it's just through the 2 layers of fabric again and no seam allowance. And then I've moved the pin back slightly, and then find the dot and put your needle of the machine in there, remove the pin, and then you may want to pin your sample together a little bit better than I have done, so put a few pins in. So we're now going to sew the front revere of the collar. So again, forward a couple of stitches and then back a couple of stitches. Don't go past the dot again, and just the 2 layers, don't sew over any seam allowance. This can be tricky if you've got bulky fabric, but take your time. And then sew the front lapel all the way down the front of the jacket. Now I'm just doing a collar sample here, so I won't be sewing across the bottom to create the hem. So you repeat the same for the other side as I've just done here. As you can see, my seam allowances are pinned up out of the way, and they're quite free, and they've not been stitched over at all. Just check everything's okay, nothing's caught. The seam allowances move quite freely around the neck, and then I'm going to trim the corners away, and then trim down my seam allowance. So this is different for different thicknesses of fabrics. And again, you take 3 snips off of the corner, and then you can trim your seam allowances down, or you can layer your seam allowances. So because this is a lightweight calico, I can trim them down equally to 5mm, and then just make sure the corner's taken off. And then as I've got a curve on the back, I'm going to clip the curve slightly, then trim it down to 0.5. Okay, so looking at the front of the lapel, if I were using a thicker fabric, I would layer the seam allowances. So I would leave one at 1 centimetre and trim off the front facing to 0.5. And this creates less bulk inside the jacket once it's turned through, so they don't sit right on top of each other and create a ridge. So you've got two different heights of seam allowance. So again, just check your corners, and when you turn them through, just pick them with a pin. Don't put your scissors inside and push them through to create the corners. And if you've not trimmed off enough, just trim off a little bit more. So take your time with this. And again, we'll pick the corners out with a pin, and just make sure the junction between the collar and the front lapel is a really nice junction. There you go. No seam allowances have been caught. So if you have a problem here, then you've caught the seam allowance. Okay, so I'm quite happy with those. So with my sleeve board, I'm going to lift it up, and then I'm going to clarify the seam allowance, the seams. So just open them up and then gently press. So you need to do this all the way round, including the back neck of the collar. And take your time while you're doing it. So open the seam first, and then just gently press with the iron to clarify the seam, and go all the way around. Okay, so this has been pressed. So now I put a pin at break point where my first buttonhole and button's going to go. So I don't want to see any seam on the outside, so what I'm going to do is do this in two separate ways. So from break point to the hem, I'm going to press on the inside of my garment, press the facing, and just make sure the seam allowance is right on the very edge, so you can just see it as you're pressing. You can just see it on the very edge up to break point, and when I turn it over you won't see it at all on the right side of the garment. So from there, break point along the revere, this is going to be the underside of the revere, so I want to use this side, and I'm going to press the seam right along the edge and roll it so I can just see the seam looking at me, just see. So I'm rolling it this way. Again, you may have to use a cloth if you've got an expensive fabric. So again, I'm rolling the seam so I can just see it on the right side of the garment, but this is where the revere folds back. So from the revere, when it folds back, you don't see any of the seam, and you continue this round the collar. So I'm working on the right side of the garment because this folds back and is underneath when it's on the body. Pick out any corners if you're not quite happy with them, and then I'm going to press the back of the collar. Can you see the seam just along there? Because the under collar is slightly smaller than the top collar, so the seam should roll underneath, and that's what you want it to do. Gently press this so that when I turn it to the right side when it's on the body and go around the neck, you won't see the seam at all. And do the same on the other side. So just check everything's okay. Okay, so I've given it a good press and I'm working from the inside, and I'm just going to sew my neck seam allowances together to hold the collar together. So find your original points, make sure they're on top of each other, and just pin 2 layers of seam allowance together. So 2 layers will be tucked up into the collar and the other 2 will be facing the garment. So I'm just going to pin them together, and I'm going to find them, make sure I line up the shoulder seams of the facing and the outer garment. So find the junction of those and put those together. So it's just the 2 layers that you're pinning together. This can be hand stitched, or you can tack it on the machine, so you can hand tack it along there if you prefer, because it could be quite bulky to get this under a machine if it's a heavy wool. So now I've pinned it to the seam allowances together, I'm just going to run a tacking stitch to hold the sections together. So this holds the collar together so you can't pull it apart when it's on the body. So the 2 neck seams are sewn or tacked together. And again, this can be hand sewn. Just be careful not to catch anything underneath. Okay, so here's my collar and the lapels, the break point where the buttons will go. Sits up around the neck, folds around the back of the neck and hugs the neck. Okay, so there's no seams showing, and it sits nicely at the back with no seams showing. It's tucked underneath. It curves around the back. So that's my Rever collar. The junctions are nice and neat.